We're now going to look at a subsistence allowance. Now, again, please remember that there are only two allowances against which you can claim deductions. Only the following allowance you can claim deductions against. It's a terrible sentence, but you get what I'm saying. And that is a travel allowance and a subsistence allowance. Again, remember, all other allowances you include 100%. You do not deduct deductions against it. So for example, if you get a cell phone allowance, you do not deduct cell phone costs against a cell phone allowance. You include the allowance in full, and you completely separately consider the deductions. They have nothing to do with each other. In reality, you get it an allowance because you incur expenses, but for tax purposes, remember they have nothing to do with each other. We're now looking at a subsistence allowance. Now, a subsistence allowance is when your employer gives you money for when you have to be away from your usual home or place where you stay for work. So for example, let's say that you are living and you stay in Johannesburg and you are an article clerk and your employer tells you that you need to go to Cape Town to go for an audit and you have to go for 2 or 3 weeks. So you leave Johannesburg and you have to go and temporarily stay in Cape Town in a hotel. Your employer pays for it. That's the subsistence allowance. If they give you money, remember, so they must give you the money to pay for it. The rule here is that you need to spend at least one night away to qualify for a deduction. I'm going to say yeah, to qualify for a deduction. If you do not, so for example, if your employer, you don't have to spend one night away, so you're working in Johannesburg, and your employer just says, quickly go to Pretoria, and Pretoria is not that far from Johannesburg, and you go to Pretoria for 2 hours and you come back, and your employer pays for something there, then you can't get a deduction for it. You'll be taxed on that. You have to spend at least one night away. Because basically the idea here is that if it's still within the same work day, your employer shouldn't have to pay for you for meals and things. Right, so at least one night away. Now, the employer can give you money for three things: for accommodation and for meals and incidental costs. Now you'll see I've used a different color here for a reason, and that is because, like we've seen before when we look at a travel allowance, for example, it works as follows. The subsistence allowance, you use costs, sorry, this is for the cost or the deduction. You use the greater of actual or deemed cost. Okay, so let's say now, for example, so I'll just quickly explain to you. Accommodation, so if your employer gives you money for accommodation, your employer is giving you money so that you can pay for a hotel, for example. If your employer gives you money for meals, obviously it's for food. If your employer gives you money for incidental costs are things like paying for parking, giving someone tips, buying a newspaper, things that you would usually buy at home, but which they're now covering. Right? But it's just so normal costs, everyday, day-to-day costs, basically. Now, how it works is, for accommodation, if you want to claim a deduction for it, you must keep a record of the actual costs. There is no deemed cost available for accommodation. So if your employer says, here's an allowance for accommodation, 5,000 rands, and you, let's say, you actually spend 4,000 rands. If you keep a record of that 4,000 rands, if this is your tax calculation, 5,000 rands would be included for the allowance, and 4,000 rands would be allowed to be claimed as a deduction. If you did not keep a record of the actual cost, there would be no deduction available either. Okay, let me now change it and just explain all the rest. So, you can then also now get for meals and incidental costs, or just for incidental costs. Basically is how it's broken down in the Act. Now, The rate, these deemed costs, you get it in your regulation and notices section of your SACA student handbook. There's also a document on the student platform called tax rates and tax tables. Guys, I wouldn't recommend that you study this off by heart. Study the principle. You will have some sort of document in the exam, either your SACA student handbook, and if not, if there's any rate changes, or if they require you, or if you have an old SACA student handbook, they typically provide you with the some document with the tax rates and that you need to use, or it's given in the question sometimes. So don't fret about that. You will have the information in the exam. Understand the principle. So if let's say your employer gives you money for meals plus incidental costs, and let's say they give you 2,000 rands, and you must spend 2 days away. They say days and part of days, right? To spend 2 days away. Now, your actual cost that you incur on meals and incidental costs, you keep a record, is 1,200 rands. The deemed cost, right, I'm just writing it here, they'll give to you per day. So let's say it is 500 rands per day. Guys, make sure that you listen. This is not the correct rate. You need to go and look at the rate in your SACA student handbook or in this document. It's the principle I'm explaining here. This rate changes every year, and they can give you different rates even in an exam if they want. So let's say it's 500 rands a day currently. So the deemed would then be 500 rands a day. It's for 2 days, so the deemed would be 1,000. So you choose the greater of those two. In this case, it's the actual cost of 1,200. So you include, for the rands amount, you include the 2,000 rands allowance that you received, and you deduct the highest of the deemed or the actual. So if you don't have the actual, you can still use the deemed only, so it'll become 1,000. That's only available for meals and incidental costs, or for incidental costs. It's not available for accommodation.